The last bolt missed my skull by 3 inches. I felt its passage, the heat of it scorching the air beside my ear, the sharp ozone tang flooding my nostrils, the crack of superheated atmosphere collapsing in on itself. The wall behind me exploded into powderonite fragments, and I was already running before my mind had fully processed that I was still alive. I have been running for 19 days. My name is Torvin Malchus. I was a records clerk in the Administratum Annex of Hive Septimus on Veldran IV. I had a small hab unit on level 47, a commendation for 15 years of faithful service, and a pension that would have allowed me to retire in modest comfort at the age of 63. I owned 4 sets of work robes, a chronometer that had belonged to my father, and a single picked capture of my daughter taken the day she entered the Schola Progenium. That man is dead now. The Inquisition killed him 19 days ago, and what runs through these underhive tunnels is something else. Something hunted, something hollow, something that wears his face but has forgotten what it felt like to be him. Let me tell you how this happens. Let me testify to what it means to be marked by the Holy Ordos, to feel the eye of the Emperor's most terrible servants turn toward you with cold and absolute focus. Let me explain why I am guilty of nothing and condemned regardless, why innocence is no shield against those who hunt in the Emperor's name, why the only choice left to me is between deaths, the death that comes from their hands, or the death that comes from my own exhaustion in these lightless tunnels where I have been driven like vermin before a flame. The tunnels smell of rust and stagnant water and something else, something organic that I have learned not to investigate too closely. The darkness is absolute in places. My lumen stick died 6 days ago, and I navigate now by touch alone. My fingers trailing along walls slick with condensation and substances I prefer not to identify. I have eaten what I could find, fungal growths that tasted of copper, blind insects that crunched between my teeth, water filtered through my own clothing to remove the worst of the chemical contamination. I have slept in crawl spaces too small for a grown man, my body folded into configurations that leave my joints screaming when I wake. And still they come. Still I hear them in the distance, the heavy tread of armored boots, the whine of scanning equipment, the voices that echo through the tunnels calling my name as though I might answer, as though I might simply surrender and accept whatever fate they have prepared for me. I will not surrender. I cannot. Not because I believe in my own survival. That delusion abandoned me somewhere around the 7th day. But because surrender implies that there is something to confess, some guilt to acknowledge, some crime that justifies what they have done and what they intend to do. I am innocent. I cling to that truth like a drowning man clings to wreckage, because it is the only thing I have left. The only possession that cannot be taken from me by those who have already taken everything else. It began with a number. I must explain this carefully, for it is the hinge upon which my entire existence has turned, the single point of failure that transformed a loyal servant of the Imperium into a fugitive marked for death. I was a records clerk. I have said this already, but you must understand what that means. What function I served in the vast machinery of imperial bureaucracy. I processed data. I verified figures. I ensured that the endless streams of information flowing through the Administratum Annex were accurate, complete, and properly filed for the archives that would preserve them across the centuries. I was good at my work. This was my sin. The discrepancy was small. So small that any other clerk would have overlooked it, would have allowed it to pass unremarked into the archives where it would have been buried beneath millennia of accumulated data. A difference of 37 units in a cargo manifest. 37 units of processed nutrition paste, logged as delivered to a lower hive distribution center, but never received by the facility's own records. 37 units. In a shipment of 14 million. I flagged it. Emperor, preserve me. I flagged it for review. I wrote a notation in my careful script, attached it to the relevant documents, and submitted it through the proper channels as I had been trained to do, as I had done 10,000 times before, with 10,000 other minor discrepancies that were investigated and resolved and forgotten. This one was not forgotten. The Inquisitor came 3 days later. I did not know what she was at first. She wore the robes of an administratum auditor, carried the credentials of a departmental overseer, spoke with the clipped efficiency of a career bureaucrat conducting a routine investigation. She sat across from my desk in the cramped office I shared with 4 other clerks, and she asked me questions about the discrepancy I had flagged, about the processes I had followed, about my methodology and my training and my record of service. I answered everything. I showed her my documentation. I walked her through my reasoning step by step, proud of the diligence I had demonstrated, certain that this attention from higher authority could only reflect well upon my career. Then she asked me who else knew. The question seemed strange at the time. I told her that I had discussed the discrepancy with no one. This was true, for such matters were routine and required no consultation. I told her that the only record of my discovery existed in the documentation I had already provided. I told her that I had followed procedure exactly, had deviated in no way from the protocols that governed my work. She nodded. She made a notation on her data slate, and then she looked at me with eyes that had changed somehow, that had become cold and evaluative in a way that made my stomach clench with sudden, inexplicable fear. "You understand," she said, "that what you have discovered cannot be permitted to spread." I did not understand. I told her so. I asked what she meant, what the discrepancy signified. What could possibly be so significant about 37 units of nutrition paste that it required this level of attention? She smiled. It was not a kind expression. "The nutrition paste is irrelevant," she said. "What matters is the gap. What matters is that you have demonstrated the capacity to find gaps where others see only continuity. What matters is that you have proven yourself capable of noticing things that are meant to remain unnoticed." She stood. She straightened her robes, and she spoke words that ended my life as surely as any bolt round through the skull. "You are now a liability, Clerk Malchus. The Holy Ordos thanks you for your service and regrets the necessity of what must follow. You have 24 hours before the kill teams are dispatched. I suggest you use them wisely." Then she left. She simply walked out of my office, past my colleagues who had noticed nothing unusual, through the corridors I had walked every day for 15 years, and vanished into the vast machinery of the hive as though she had never existed. I sat at my desk for 7 minutes. I remember counting, because counting was something I could do, something familiar and routine in a universe that had suddenly become alien and hostile. 7 minutes of paralysis, of disbelief, of desperate hope that this was some manner of test or misunderstanding that could be resolved through proper channels. Then I ran. I abandoned everything, my work, my hab unit, my commendation, and my pension, and my father's chronometer. I took only the clothes I wore and what few thrones I had in my pockets, and I fled into the lower hive where the administratum's reach grows thin and the shadows grow deep. I have been running ever since, and they have been following. This is what it means to be hunted by the Inquisition. The Underhive is not a place designed for human habitation. It is the detritus of millennia. the accumulated waste of a civilization that builds ever upward and allows what lies below to rot and collapse into darkness. The tunnels through which I flee were once corridors, once streets, once the proud thoroughfares of a city that has long since been buried beneath the weight of its own growth. Now they are arteries of rust and shadow, inhabited by things that have adapted to lightlessness and learned to fear the surface dwellers who sometimes descend with flamers and determination. I learned quickly that I was not alone in my flight. The woman found me on the 4th day in a collapsed junction where 3 tunnels converged into a space that might once have been a market square. I had stopped to rest, my legs trembling with exhaustion, my throat raw from breathing air thick with chemical residue. I did not hear her approach. She moved with the silence of someone who had learned that sound meant death, and I became aware of her presence only when she spoke from the darkness 3 meters to my left. "You are making too much noise." I scrambled backward, my hands scrabbling for a weapon I did not possess, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force that I was certain she could hear it. But she did not attack. She simply waited, a shadow among shadows, until my panic subsided enough for reason to reassert itself. "Who are you?" I managed. "Someone who was where you are now, 19 years ago." She moved closer, and I caught the faintest impression of her features in the ambient glow of phosphorescent fungus. A face that had once been beautiful, now carved by time and hardship into something harder, sharper, more suited to survival in this place. "My name does not matter. Names are the first thing they use to find you. I stopped using mine the day I came down here." She had been a medici, she told me later, a chirurgeon of some skill who had served in one of the upper hive hospitals where the wealthy sought treatment for ailments both real and imagined. She had discovered something in the course of her work, something about the medications being distributed to certain patients, something that connected to people whose names she should never have learned, and whose activities she should never have suspected. She had not flagged a discrepancy. She had not submitted documentation through proper channels. She had simply asked a question of the wrong person at the wrong time, and that had been enough. "The Inquisition does not hunt guilt," she said, as we moved together through tunnels she knew, and I did not. "It hunts knowledge. It hunts the capacity for knowledge. It hunts anyone who might know something, or might learn something, or might someday speak of something they do not even realize they have witnessed. Guilt is irrelevant. Innocence is irrelevant. What matters is the risk you represent, the possibility, however small, that information might escape through you into places it should not go." I wanted to disbelieve her. I wanted to cling to the notion that the Imperium I had served for 15 years operated on principles of justice and proportion, that there was some process of appeal, some authority to whom I might present my case and receive fair judgment. But I had seen the Inquisitor's eyes when she pronounced my death sentence. I had heard the absolute certainty in her voice, and I had spent 4 days running through darkness while kill teams swept the tunnels behind me, and I understood now that fairness was a concept that had no meaning in the vocabulary of those who pursued me. "How do you survive?" I asked. 19 years. How is it possible?" She laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. You learn, you adapt, you become something other than what you were, something that can exist in the spaces between their attention. The Inquisition is vast, but it is not infinite. They have priorities. They have other threats. If you can survive the initial hunt, if you can make yourself small enough and quiet enough and patient enough, you can exist in the gaps they cannot be bothered to fill. She showed me. In the days that followed, she taught me the geography of the Underhive, the safe passages and the death traps. the places where food could be found, and the places where predators waited for the unwary. She introduced me to others, a network of the damned men and women who had fled the Inquisition's attention for reasons as varied as my own, who had built a shadow society in the ruins beneath the Hive's awareness. There were 17 of them when I arrived. 17 souls who had learned to live in the cracks, to survive on scraps and silence, to exist as ghosts in a world that had marked them for death. They came from every stratum of imperial society, former administrators like myself, laborers who had witnessed things they should not have seen, even a priest who had asked questions about certain rituals conducted in the deeper crypts of his cathedral. All of them innocent by any reasonable standard, all of them condemned regardless. I learned their names, though I knew I should not. I learned their stories, though each one was a weight added to the burden I already carried. I learned that the Inquisition's reach extended far beyond what I had imagined, that the Holy Orders concerned themselves not merely with heresy and mutation and the great threats to imperial stability, but with the maintenance of secrets so vast and so terrible that entire populations might be sacrificed to preserve them. "What are they hiding?" I asked the woman. I had begun to think of her as the surgeon, though she never confirmed this name. What could be worth this? The resources they spend hunting us, the agents they deploy, the decades they invest in tracking down people who know nothing of any real significance. What could possibly justify such expenditure? She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten too little. "Everything," she said. "They are hiding everything. The true nature of the Imperium, the compromises upon which it is built, the lies that hold it together. Do you think the masses could function if they knew what lurked beyond the veil? Do you think civilization would survive if the average citizen understood the full scope of the threats arrayed against humanity? The Inquisition does not merely hunt heretics. It hunts truth itself, wherever that truth might threaten the stability of the structures that keep humanity alive." I did not want to believe her, but I had been a records clerk. I had spent 15 years processing data, noting discrepancies, observing the gaps between what was recorded and what was real. And I had always known, on some level, I refused to consciously acknowledge, that the archives contained absences as significant as their contents, holes in the record where information should have been, patterns of deletion that suggested systematic rather than accidental loss. I had found one such hole, one small gap in the great machinery of imperial record keeping, and for that discovery, I had been sentenced to death. The kill team found us on the 31st day. We had grown complacent. This is the trap of survival. The longer you endure, the more you begin to believe that endurance is possible, that the methods which have preserved you will continue to preserve you, that the future will resemble the past. We had established routines. We had created safe houses. We had begun to believe that we had found a way to exist outside the Inquisition's reach. We were wrong. They came through 3 tunnels simultaneously, their movements coordinated with military precision, their equipment designed for exactly this kind of operation. I heard the screaming before I understood what was happening, a sound that echoed through the corridors and seemed to come from everywhere at once. The voices of men and women I had come to know being cut short one by one as the kill team advanced. The surgeon grabbed my arm and pulled me into a side passage I had not known existed, a crack in the wall barely wide enough to admit a human body. We pressed ourselves into the darkness, our breathing shallow, our bodies contorted to fit the impossibly narrow space, and we listened as the hunters moved past. I heard Garvin die. He had been a dock worker, a man whose only crime was delivering a cargo crate to an address that later proved to be connected to something the Inquisition wished to remain unknown. I heard him beg, not for mercy, for he knew there would be none, but for a quick death, for an end to the pain they were inflicting in their search for information he did not possess. They did not grant his request. The sounds continued for a very long time. I heard Petra die. She had been a scribe, a woman who had copied documents without reading them, but whose hand had touched papers that bore secrets too dangerous to leave witnesses. Her death was quicker than Garvin's. A single last shot that echoed through the tunnels, and then silence. I think she was lucky. I heard voices demanding names, demanding locations, demanding information about networks and contacts and anyone else who might have learned things they should not know. I heard the responses, screams that resolved into words, words that became names, names that condemned others to the same fate. This is what the Inquisition understands that I did not before I became their quarry. Pain is a universal solvent. Given sufficient application, it will dissolve any loyalty, any conviction, any determination to protect others. The people who died in those tunnels were not weak. They were not cowards. They had survived for years, some of them for decades, demonstrating courage and resilience beyond anything I had imagined possible. But the Inquisition had refined the art of interrogation across 10,000 years of practice, and they knew exactly how to extract information from subjects who wished desperately to remain silent. The surgeon and I remained in our crack in the wall for 6 hours after the last sounds faded. We did not speak. We did not move. We barely breathed. And when we finally emerged, crawling through the narrow space into a tunnel that smelled of blood and lass fire, we found what remained of 17 people who had committed no crime except the crime of knowledge. I will not describe what we saw. Some things should not be given words, should not be fixed in language that might allow them to be remembered too clearly. I will say only that the Inquisition had been thorough, that they had left nothing to chance, that the bodies we found had been treated in ways designed to extract maximum information and leave minimum evidence. There were no survivors. Of the 17 who had welcomed me into their hidden community, who had taught me to survive, who had shared what little they had with a stranger marked for the same death they had fled, not one remained. Only the surgeon and I had escaped. Only we two had been lucky enough, if luck is the proper word, to be positioned near a passage the kill team had not discovered. We fled deeper into the underhive, into regions even the surgeon had never explored, where the tunnels grew strange and the darkness seemed to press against us with almost physical weight. We did not speak of what we had witnessed. We did not speak at all, for speech seemed inadequate to contain the horror of what had happened, and silence was at least honest in its failure to address the unaddressable. I understood now what I was facing. I understood that the Inquisition was not merely an organization, but a force of nature, an aspect of the Imperium as fundamental as gravity or entropy. It could be fled. It could perhaps be evaded for a time by those fortunate or skilled enough to find the gaps in its attention, but it could not be escaped. It could not be reasoned with. It could not be appeased or satisfied or convinced that its quarry posed no threat. The Inquisition hunted knowledge, and I had become knowledge. Everything I had seen, everyone I had known, every secret I had accumulated in my flight through the underhive, all of it made me more dangerous, more valuable, more necessary to eliminate. My survival was no longer merely my own concern. It was a security breach, a gap in the containment that the Holy Ordos maintained around truths too dangerous for common knowledge. I had been innocent when I fled. Truly, genuinely innocent of any crime except diligence. But innocence is not a permanent state when the Inquisition hunts you. Every day of survival was a day of learning, and every lesson learned was another mark against me. Another reason why my death had become necessary, not merely as punishment, but as prophylaxis. I was no longer an innocent man fleeing unjust persecution. I was a vessel of dangerous knowledge, and vessels can be broken. The surgeon died on the 47th day. We had found refuge in a section of the underhive that had once been a water treatment facility, its vast tanks long since drained, its machinery corroded into abstract sculptures of rust and decay. The space was defensible. Only 2 approaches, both narrow enough to bottleneck any pursuit, and it contained resources we desperately needed. Sealed containers of purification chemicals that could be traded to the scavenger tribes who dwelt in the deeper tunnels, filtration equipment that still functioned well enough to render the toxic groundwater marginally potable. We had been there for 9 days when she began to cough. It started as nothing, a minor irritation, the kind of respiratory complaint that anyone living in the chemical-laden air of the underhive might develop. She dismissed my concern with the pragmatic fatalism that had kept her alive for 19 years. Bodies failed, lungs scarred. These were the costs of survival, and they were paid without complaint, or they were not paid at all. But the cough worsened. By the 3rd day, she was bringing up blood, dark clots that spoke of damage deep in the tissue of her lungs, the kind of damage that no amount of rest or scavenged medication could repair. By the 5th day, she could no longer walk without support. By the 7th, she could not walk at all. I stayed with her. This was foolish. Every hour I remained in one location was an hour the kill teams might use to narrow their search, an hour in which my trail might be rediscovered by hunters who had surely not abandoned their pursuit. But she had saved my life. She had taught me how to survive, and I could not bring myself to leave her alone in the darkness, waiting for death in the ruins of a civilization that had forgotten she existed. She spoke in those final days of things she had never mentioned before, of a daughter she had been forced to abandon when she fled, a child of 6 years who would now be a woman of 25, assuming she had survived the scrutiny that surely followed her mother's disappearance, of a husband who had reported her location to the authorities in exchange for clemency, who had traded her life for his own safety, who had taught her that love was a vulnerability the hunted could not afford, of the years she had spent in the darkness, watching others die, learning to harden herself against the losses that accumulated like sediment in the depths of her soul. "I thought I had succeeded," she said, her voice a wet rasp that seemed to cost her enormous effort. "I thought I had become something that could not be hurt anymore. But I was wrong. You reminded me. Your fear, your confusion, your desperate need to believe that the universe still contained justice. You reminded me of what I was before I learned to be this." I did not know what to say. I held her hand, feeling the bones beneath skin that had grown papery and thin, and I listened to her breathing grow more labored with each passing hour. "They will find you eventually," she said. "You know this. No matter how far you run, no matter how deep you hide, they will find you. The Inquisition does not forget. The Inquisition does not forgive. The Inquisition does not stop." "Then what is the point?" I asked. "Why run at all if the ending is certain?" She smiled, a terrible expression on a face that had become a mask of suffering. "Because the running is the point. Because every day you survive is a day you have stolen from them. Because you are still human, still capable of choice, still possessed of a will that belongs to you and not to the machine that wishes to consume you." She coughed, and the sound was liquid, drowning. They want you to surrender. They want you to accept that resistance is futile, that their authority is absolute, that the only rational response to their pursuit is submission. Do not give them that satisfaction. Make them work for your death. Make them spend resources, expend agents, dedicate attention that might otherwise be turned toward others. Every moment of your survival is an act of defiance. She died an hour later. I buried her in one of the empty filtration tanks, covering her body with the chemical croute that had accumulated on its walls over centuries of disuse. I did not speak words over her grave. I did not know what words would be appropriate, and she had never expressed any faith that might have guided such a ritual. I simply stood in the darkness for a long time, feeling the weight of her absence, understanding that I was now truly alone. The Imperium does not count such deaths. Across 10,000 worlds, in the shadows beneath 1,000,000 hives, people die every day, fleeing powers they cannot comprehend, guilty of nothing except the misfortune of knowing or seeing or simply being in the wrong place when secrets passed by. They leave no records. They receive no memorials. They vanish from the archives as though they had never existed, their names erased, their histories deleted, their very existence retroactively unmade by the machinery of Imperial information control. I was one of them now. When I died, not if, but when, there would be no record that Torvin Malchus had ever lived. My 15 years of service would be expunged. My commendation would be deleted. My daughter, if she still lived, would be told that her father had never existed, or that he had been a traitor, or whatever story best served the Inquisition's purposes. I would become a gap in the archives, an absence where a man had once been, and the universe would continue as though I had never drawn breath. I moved on. There was nothing else to do. The surgeon had given me knowledge, had equipped me with the skills and information I needed to survive in this place, and I owed it to her memory to use those gifts for as long as I could. The deeper tunnels were different from the regions I had known. The architecture shifted, becoming older, stranger, marked by designs that did not match any imperial standard I had learned in my years as a records clerk. I found chambers carved with symbols I did not recognize, passages that seemed to follow geometries that hurt to contemplate, spaces where the darkness felt thicker, more substantial, more aware. I was not the only thing moving in those depths. The creatures came on the 53rd day. They were not human. I understood this immediately, though I could not have articulated precisely what they were. They moved on too many limbs, their bodies configured in ways that suggested neither mammal nor insect, nor anything else that belonged in the natural order. They made sounds that were not quite language, but carried meaning, nonetheless. Clicks and whistles that seemed to communicate complex information through frequencies I could barely perceive. I hid. I had become expert at hiding, at folding myself into spaces that should not have accommodated a human body, at controlling my breathing and my heartbeat until I became indistinguishable from the stone and rust that surrounded me. The creatures passed within meters of my position, their strange limbs clicking against the tunnel floor, their sensory organs, if that is what they were, sweeping the darkness for prey. They did not find me. I do not know why. Perhaps my stillness was sufficient. Perhaps they were searching for something else, something that moved or smelled or radiated in ways I did not. Perhaps I was simply lucky, in the way that the condemned are sometimes lucky, granted a few more hours or days of existence by the arbitrary mercy of chance. When they had passed, I emerged from my hiding place and continued my descent. I had nowhere else to go. The upper tunnels were still being swept by inquisitorial kill teams. I had seen evidence of their passage, the distinctive burn marks of las weapons, the scattered remains of those who had been caught. The only direction that offered any possibility of escape was down, into regions that the Inquisition had perhaps not yet reached, into depths where even their authority might grow thin. I found others there. Not a community like the one the surgeon had introduced me to, but individuals, isolated survivors who had fled so deep and so far that they had lost all contact with anything resembling human society. They lived like animals, these lost souls, foraging and hiding and fighting over scraps of resources in the absolute darkness. Some of them had been down here for so long that they had forgotten their own names, their own histories, their own reasons for flight. They existed in a perpetual present, concerned only with the immediate demands of survival, their minds stripped of everything that was not essential to drawing one more breath. I spoke with one of them, a man whose age was impossible to determine, whose eyes had adapted to the darkness until they reflected light like a cat's, whose skin had grown pale as cave fish from decades without sun. He could not remember who he had been before he came to this place. He could not remember why he had fled, or who had pursued him, or what crime he had committed or witnessed. He remembered only the running, the hiding, the endless vigilance against threats he could no longer name. "They stopped hunting me," he said, and his voice was rusty with disuse, the words emerging slowly as though he had to remember how to form them. "Years ago, decades maybe, I waited for them to come, but they never came. I think they forgot about me. I think I became too small, too insignificant, too lost to be worth the effort of finding." He did not seem happy about this. He seemed, if anything, bereft, as though the pursuit that had driven him into the darkness had also given his existence meaning. And without it, he was simply waiting, purposeless, for a death that refused to arrive. "Is that what survival looks like?" I asked. "Is that what I'm running toward?" He stared at me with those reflective eyes, and I saw nothing in them. No wisdom, no warning, no comfort. Only emptiness. Only the hollow gaze of a man who had survived so completely that there was nothing left of him to save. I left him there in the darkness. I continued my descent, and I wondered, as I moved through tunnels that grew ever stranger and more ancient, whether there was any meaningful difference between the death the Inquisition offered and the death this man had found. The death of identity, of memory, of everything that made a human being more than simply a collection of biological processes, continuing without purpose or meaning. The mathematics of the Inquisition's hunt began to clarify themselves in my mind. I calculated, as I walked, the resources that must have been expended in my pursuit, the agents deployed, the equipment utilized, the hours of labor invested in tracking one former records clerk through the bowels of a hive that contained billions of souls. The numbers were staggering. The cost was absurd by any rational standard of resource allocation. But the Inquisition did not operate by rational standards. It operated by absolute ones. A threat to information security was not weighed against other priorities, was not balanced against competing demands, was not evaluated in terms of cost versus benefit. It was simply eliminated, whatever the price. Because the alternative, the possibility that dangerous knowledge might escape into the broader population, was unacceptable regardless of the probability. Across the Imperium, I understood now, thousands of such hunts were underway at any given moment. Thousands of kill teams pursuing thousands of targets through thousands of environments, expending resources that could have fed worlds, armed regiments, built ships. The Inquisition was not merely an organization, It was an industry, a vast machinery of suppression that consumed lives and treasure on a scale that defied comprehension. And I was one tiny gear in that machinery, one target among thousands, one gap in the archives that would be closed, one leak that would be plugged, one vessel of dangerous knowledge that would be shattered. On the 61st day, I found the door. It was not a door in any conventional sense, not a portal designed for human passage, not a threshold that invited crossing. It was a membrane, a barrier, a place where the tunnel I had been following simply ended and something else began. The material was neither metal nor stone, nor any substance I could identify. It pulsed faintly with light that had no visible source, and when I placed my hand against it, I felt warmth and something else. A vibration, a frequency, a sense of vast spaces opening beyond the barrier into dimensions I could not perceive. I knew I should not touch it. I knew that whatever lay beyond this door was almost certainly more dangerous than anything the Inquisition could threaten. I knew that the things I had glimpsed in the deep tunnels, the creatures with too many limbs, the geometries that hurt to contemplate, were probably connected to this place, probably emerged from whatever realm existed on the other side of this pulsing membrane. But the kill teams were still behind me. I could hear them now, distantly, the echoes of their movements carrying through the stone, growing closer with each passing hour. They had followed me into the depths. They had not given up, had not decided that one records clerk was not worth the investment of resources, had not forgotten. The Inquisition does not forget. I stood before the door and I considered my options. I could continue running, fleeing deeper into tunnels that might offer no further escape. I could hide again, hoping that my skills had improved enough to evade hunters who had already proven their ability to find those who did not wish to be found. I could surrender, presenting myself to the kill teams and accepting whatever fate they chose to inflict, hoping only that the end might be quick. Or I could open the door. The surgeon's words echoed in my memory. Every moment of your survival is an act of defiance. I pressed my hand against the membrane, and I felt it yield beneath my touch, and I stepped through into whatever waited on the other side. The chamber beyond the door was not a chamber at all. It was a space that defied the concept of enclosure, a vastness that stretched in directions I could not name, illuminated by light that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of reality rather than any identifiable source. I stood upon something that might have been a floor, though it felt more like standing upon the surface of a still lake, solid enough to support my weight, yet somehow liquid, somehow shifting beneath my feet in ways that suggested depths I could not perceive. I was not alone. The figure that waited for me in that impossible space wore the shape of a woman, though I understood immediately that this was a courtesy, a concession to my limited perceptions, rather than a reflection of any true form. She was tall, impossibly tall. Her proportions stretched in ways that should have been grotesque, but instead seemed merely alien, merely other, merely beyond the categories my mind attempted to impose upon her. Her skin was the color of starlight. Her eyes were holes that opened onto infinities, and when she spoke, her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, from within my skull and from the distant edges of the space that contained us. "You have come very far," she said, "for a creature with such a brief span of existence." I should have been afraid. I had encountered horrors in my flight through the underhive, creatures that defied natural law, spaces that violated geometry, darkness that seemed to possess intention and malice. But this was different. This was beyond fear, beyond the categories of threat and safety that had governed my existence since the moment I fled my desk in the administratum annex. I stood in the presence of something that existed outside the framework of my understanding, and fear seemed as irrelevant as anger or hope or any other human emotion. "What are you?" I asked. "A question without meaning," she replied. "What I am cannot be expressed in the vocabulary your species has developed. I am older than your stars. I am larger than your comprehension. I am a fragment of something that existed before your universe learned to cohere. And I will persist long after your species has dissolved back into the quantum foam from which it emerged." She moved toward me, or I moved toward her, or the space between us simply ceased to exist, and I felt her attention settle upon me like the weight of oceans, like the pressure of atmospheres, like the gravity of suns. "You have been pursued," she said. "I have watched your flight with interest. The patterns you have traced through the understructure of this hive have been aesthetically pleasing. The mathematics of your evasion, the geometry of your fear, the elegant desperation of a small thing fleeing powers it cannot comprehend. These have provided me with a diversion I had not expected. I am entertainment to you," I said. It was not a question. "You are many things. Entertainment, yes, but also information. Your existence carries data about the structures that pursue you, about the mechanisms by which your species maintains its fragile coherence, about the compromises and cruelties that allow your imperium to persist against the forces that seek to consume it." She tilted her head, a gesture that seemed borrowed, practiced, not quite natural to whatever she truly was. "The Inquisition is fascinating. A self-consuming system, feeding upon its own citizens to protect them from threats they must never be permitted to understand. Your species builds such elaborate structures to preserve its ignorance. Can you help me?" The words emerged before I could consider whether they were wise, before I could calculate the risks of requesting aid from something so far beyond my understanding. "Can you hide me from them? Can you make them stop?" The being laughed. The sound was not cruel, precisely, but it was vast. A mirth that contained dimensions I could not perceive, harmonics that resonated with frequencies my ears were not designed to detect. "I could unmake them," she said. "I could unravel the threads that bind their organization together, scatter their agents across probability spaces they would never escape, erase the very concept of the Inquisition from the memories of every living creature in your galaxy. This would be trivial. This would require less effort than you expend in drawing breath." Hope surged in my chest, irrational, desperate, the same hope that the surgeon had warned me against, the hope that the hunted learn to suppress because it leads only to deeper despair. "But I will not," the being continued. "Your species is engaged in a game that interests me, the balance between knowledge and ignorance, between revelation and suppression, between the truths that would destroy you and the lies that keep you alive. This balance is delicate, and I would not disturb it for the sake of one small creature whose suffering has provided me with momentary amusement." The hope died. Of course it died. I had learned this lesson already, had learned it in the tunnels beneath the hive, had learned it watching the surgeon's body fail, had learned it standing over the remains of 17 people who had committed no crime except the crime of knowing. The universe did not offer salvation. The universe did not concern itself with justice or mercy or the fates of individual lives. The universe simply continued, vast and indifferent, while creatures like myself struggled and suffered and died in the spaces between its attention. "Then why show yourself to me?" I asked. "Why bring me here, to this place? if not to offer help. Because you passed through my door, she said. Because you chose to step into the unknown rather than submit to the known. Because, in that moment of decision, you demonstrated a quality I find rare among your kind, a willingness to embrace uncertainty rather than accept certain destruction. She moved closer still, and I felt her presence pressing against the boundaries of my consciousness, vast and ancient and terribly, terribly curious. I cannot save you. I will not save you. But I can offer you something else. I can offer you knowledge. Knowledge is what condemned me, I said. Knowledge is why they hunt me. More knowledge will only make my death more certain. Yes, she agreed. But it will also make your death more meaningful. You will die understanding. You will die having glimpsed, even briefly, the truth of the structures that have pursued you. Is that not preferable to dying in ignorance? Is that not worth the price? I thought of the surgeon dying in the ruins of the water treatment facility, speaking of the daughter she would never see again. I thought of Garvin and Petra and the others, dying in the tunnels while I hid in a crack in the wall and listened to their screams. I thought of the man in the deep tunnels, his memories erased, his identity dissolved, surviving so completely that nothing remained of him worth preserving. Show me, I said. She showed me. I cannot describe what I saw. The human mind is not designed to contain the visions she poured into my consciousness, the revelations she inscribed upon the trembling meat of my brain. I perceived, for one endless moment, the full architecture of the Imperium, not the political structures or the military hierarchies, but the deeper architecture, the hidden framework upon which everything else was built. I saw the compromises that held humanity together, the lies that made civilization possible, the terrible bargains struck in the Emperor's name to preserve a species that teetered always on the edge of extinction. I saw the Inquisition as it truly was, not an organization, but an immune system, not a hierarchy, but a reflex, a vast distributed network of cells and antibodies designed to identify and eliminate any threat to the body they protected. I saw the logic of my own condemnation, understood at last why my small discrepancy had triggered such a massive response. The gap I had discovered was not isolated. It was connected to other gaps, to networks of deletion and suppression that spanned millennia, to secrets so vast that their revelation would collapse the foundations of imperial society. I saw what lay beyond the boundaries of human space, the things that waited in the darkness between stars, the hungers that pressed against the walls of reality, the patient ancient intelligences that had been watching humanity since before our species learned to walk upright. I saw why ignorance was necessary, why the Inquisition's suppression was not merely justified but essential, why the alternative to their brutal methodology was extinction so complete that nothing would remain to remember we had ever existed. And I saw the Emperor, not the icon, not the image, not the golden figure that adorned 1,000,000 cathedrals and 1,000,000,000 shrines. I saw what lay beneath the mythology, the truth that the Inquisition killed to protect, the reality so terrible that its revelation would shatter faith across 10,000 worlds. The vision ended. I found myself on my knees on the not-quite floor of that impossible space, my body trembling, my mind reeling from the weight of what had been shown to me. Blood ran from my nose, from my ears, from the corners of my eyes. The physical cost of containing knowledge that human physiology was never meant to bear. Now you understand, the being said. Now you know why they hunt you. Now you know why they cannot stop. I understood. Emperor, forgive me, I understood everything. "The door behind you remains open," she continued. "The hunters will arrive within hours. You may return to the tunnels and continue your flight, bearing the knowledge I have given you, surviving as long as your flesh permits before they find you and extract what you now carry." Or, she extended a hand, if hand was the correct term for the appendage that reached toward me, an architecture of light and intention that bore only superficial resemblance to human anatomy. "You may remain here, in this space between spaces, this fold in the fabric of your reality. The hunters cannot reach you here. The Inquisition's authority does not extend into dimensions they cannot perceive. You would be safe. You would survive. Safe. Survival." The words I had been chasing since the moment I fled my desk. The goals that had driven me through 61 days of darkness and terror and loss. What would I become? I asked. If I stayed here, what would happen to me? "You would become something other than what you are. The space you would inhabit is not designed for human consciousness. Over time, and time moves strangely here, flows in directions your mind was not built to navigate. You would adapt. You would change. You would become capable of existing in this place, but you would no longer be capable of existing anywhere else. You would be preserved, but not as you are, as something new, something that remembers being human without possessing the capacity to return to humanity." I thought of the man in the deep tunnels, the empty eyes, the hollow gaze of someone who had survived so completely that there was nothing left worth saving. I thought of the surgeon. Every moment of your survival is an act of defiance. I thought of my daughter, somewhere in the Imperium, living her life without knowing that her father was still alive, still running, still refusing to submit to the powers that had marked him for death. The being waited. The door behind me pulsed with light that was not light, and somewhere in the tunnels beyond, I heard the distant echo of armored boots, of voices calling my name, of hunters closing on their quarry, with the patient certainty of those who know their prey cannot escape forever. I made my choice. I turned away from the extended hand, away from the promise of safety and survival and transformation, into something that would no longer be capable of suffering. I walked toward the door, toward the tunnels, toward the hunters who waited with weapons ready and questions prepared, and all the terrible patience of the Inquisition's 10,000-year methodology. "An interesting decision," the being said behind me. "May I ask why?" I paused at the threshold, one hand pressed against the membrane that separated this impossible space from the reality I had known. "Because I am still human," I said. "Because humanity is not merely a configuration of flesh and memory. It is a choice, made again and again, to remain what we are even when remaining costs us everything. Because the surgeon was right. Because every moment I survive as myself, as Torvin Malchus, as a man who was once a records clerk with a wife and daughters, and a small life that mattered to no one except those who lived it. Every such moment is a victory they cannot take from me." I stepped through the door, the membrane sealed behind me, and I began to run. They caught me on the 63rd day. I will not describe the capture itself. It was neither dramatic nor dignified, simply a moment when exhaustion exceeded will, when my legs refused to carry me further, when the hunters who had pursued me for so long finally closed the distance I could no longer maintain. I fell in a tunnel that smelled of rust and old water, and they were upon me before I could rise, their weapons trained on my broken body, their voices speaking words I barely heard through the roaring in my ears. I expected death. I had been expecting it for 63 days, had made my peace with it in the darkness beneath the hive, had chosen it over the alternative the being had offered. But the Inquisition does not grant such simple mercies to those who have carried knowledge as long as I had carried it. They brought me to a place I will not name, to chambers designed for the extraction of information from subjects who do not wish to provide it. They asked me questions. They applied methodologies refined across 10,000 years of practice. They were patient and thorough and utterly without malice. This was not cruelty, not from their perspective. This was necessity. This was the immune system of humanity performing its function, eliminating a threat to the body it protected. I told them everything. I am not proud of this, but I am not ashamed either. The surgeon had warned me that pain was a universal solvent, and she was right. Given sufficient application, it dissolves all resistance, all determination, all noble intentions to remain silent. I told them about the network in the underhive, about the survivors I had met, about the paths and safe houses and hidden communities that had sheltered me. I told them about the door and the being beyond it and the visions she had poured into my consciousness. They listened, they recorded, and when I had nothing left to give, when I had been emptied of every secret and every memory and every fragment of dangerous knowledge I had accumulated in my flight, they made their decision. I was not executed. This surprised me more than anything else that had happened since the Inquisitor first sat across from my desk and pronounced my death sentence. Instead, I was processed, evaluated, determined to be a resource rather than merely a threat. I serve the Inquisition now. This is the final irony, the last twist in a story that has contained so many. The very qualities that made me dangerous, my diligence, my attention to detail, my capacity to find gaps where others saw only continuity, these same qualities make me useful. I have been assigned to a task force that hunts others like myself, that tracks down those who have learned things they should not know, that closes the gaps in Imperial information security before they can spread. I am good at this work. I understand how the hunted think, how they move, where they hide. I know the underhive and its passages, know the communities that form in the darkness, know the psychology of those who flee powers they cannot comprehend. I find them. I report them. I watch as kill teams are dispatched to eliminate threats I have identified. I tell myself that this is survival. I tell myself that the surgeon would understand, that she who taught me to make them work for my death would approve of this final defiance, living on, continuing, refusing to be erased, even at the cost of becoming what I once fled. I tell myself that every day I persist is a day stolen from the machinery that sought to consume me. But in the quiet hours, when the work is done, and I am alone with the knowledge that still burns behind my eyes, I wonder if the being was right. I wonder if I should have taken her hand, accepted her offer, allowed myself to be transformed into something that could no longer suffer as I suffer now. I wonder if there is any meaningful difference between the death I escaped and the life I have purchased with the deaths of others. The Inquisition does not hunt guilt. It hunts knowledge. And I have become its instrument, turning the very skills that condemn me into weapons against those who share my original sin of seeing too clearly. I am still counting the days. 347 since I fled my desk. 347 days of survival that has cost me everything I once was. I do not know if the man who remains is still Torvin Malchus. I do not know if the choice I made in that impossible space was wisdom or cowardice, or simply the desperate reflex of a creature that had forgotten how to stop running. I know only this: I am still here. I am still human, and that will have to be enough.